So welcome and good afternoon. It's a pleasure and an excitement to be here. The library's noon monthly poetry series, Lunch Poems, was such a pleasure and such a success. It's become a kind of institution on the campus, and I've wished for a long time that we would have an equivalent series in which the campus community and students got exposed to what was most exciting things that were happening in fiction, that we needed to have a fiction reading series. And through the inspiration of Dave Dewar and Tom Leonard and the generosity of the library, which has been such a home to the cultural life of this campus, Story Hour was conceived through the curatorship of two of our novelists, Vikram Chandra and Melanie Abrams, who are sitting right there. So we need to thank Tom, Dave, Vikram, and Melanie for making this happen. We wanted to start the series with a grand writer and a Berkeley alum, and of course that meant getting Oakley Hall to come to Berkeley and read. We're very grateful that he's here. And his friend, one of Berkeley's most brilliant novelists, most recently the author of the Yiddish Policeman's Ball, a fiercely inventive and surprising writer who loves his way to find his way through every genre he can lay his hands on and do new things with it. Michael Chabon agreed to introduce Oakley and have a conversation with him. What could be better? So I'm going to get out of the way. Here's Oakley Hall and Michael Chabon.
We'll make you live. Mouth 10 inches from Mike. Okay, I didn't bring my ruler, so I'm just going to have to. Hi, thank you all so much for coming. I, of course, agreed to do this. I jumped at the chance. At the end of Charlotte's Web, there's that famous passage about what a rare thing it is to find someone who's both a good writer and a good friend. It's probably equally rare to find someone who's both a good writer and a good teacher. And Oakley Hall is both, and he means so much to me as a writer, as a teacher, and as a friend, that I'm just really thrilled and delighted to be able to be here with you today to do this. I thought I would just start, well, maybe briefly with a little bit of biographical information about Oakley, which I'll probably get wrong, so
I'll
correct me, thank you. Oakley was born in San Diego, California, and
Don't say how many.
at some point early in the, before Second World War, let's just say. And he grew up both in San Diego and in Hawaii. Both San Diego and Hawaii have been the scene for some of his best fiction. He went here to Cal for college and then fought in the Second World War in the Marines, I believe, in the Marines. And on the GI Bill, ended up attending the famous writers' workshop at Iowa in early days. And eventually, after he began to establish himself as a novelist, ended up running the writers' workshop, the fiction writing program at UC Irvine from the very beginning, and ran it for about 20 years. Exactly 20 years. And that is how we know each other, because I was in the MFA program at Irvine. I guess before I get personal, I just want to say so many of Oakley's books mean so much to me. Children of the Sun. I love the Ambrose Bierce detective novels, the Corpus of Joe Bailey, and then his most recent novel that is in many ways kind of a bookend to Corpus of Joe Bailey, Love and War in California. They're all wonderful books, but Warlock, if you haven't ever read Warlock by Oakley Hall, you're just really depriving yourself of one of the great privileges you can have and pleasures you can have as a reader.
I was told the margins aren't wide enough.
The margins aren't wide enough. Well, I didn't bring my ruler again, so I can't really measure them, but I don't remember noticing that. If you want to see just, not only what the Western novel is capable of, but what the American novel is capable of. And also, if anybody here was fond of the television program Deadwood, and you want to see where they stole all the everything from, especially the way the characters speak to one another, just check out Warlock. It's such a wonderful novel. All I wanted to say about Oakley as a teacher is that when I showed up at UC Irvine in 1985, I had begun work on a novel. I was under the impression that you had to be writing a novel if you were in graduate school in fiction writing. And it seemed to me, I went down for a visit to check it out down there, and it seemed to me that everybody was writing a novel. So I started a novel, and I showed up. I had 110 pages of it when I started in the fall. And Oakley asked if he could read them, and I gave them to Oakley to read, and he summoned me into his office. And he was gentle, but he was he was unsparing, let's say. And when he sent me away after having told me that I had far too many characters and no story and nothing was happening and there was not enough danger and it was 110 pages, and when was I going to get down to it already? So he sent me back to the drawing board, and I cut all but about 15 pages and essentially started all over again with a much clearer sense of telling a story, that was my job.
Published it.
And published it. Well, and what I want to say is then after that, so he was completely and utterly responsible for what the novel became. And then after it came out, somebody interviewed him, asked him about Mysteries of Pittsburgh, and he went on record saying that nobody could tell me anything, and that I had, refused to listen to all the. Yeah, you did. So. Which I think it was very kind of you, because the way I interpret it is what you were saying was somehow I just was I was born fully grown and.
All I did for you was get out of your way.
Exactly. And that was just so not true. You were so in my way, and it was so completely useful and instructive and important, and I got so much out of your being in my way, and I'm so eternally grateful for that. So that's all I want to say. I wanted to just start out by asking you about the fact that your first novel, your first two novels were both hard-boiled detective novels, if I'm not mistaken. Was it the first two?
First one.
First one?
Yeah, and the second one was kind of a first novel with suspense element. The first novel was a detective novel, Murder City. What else could it be? And the second novel, So Many Doors, was I during my college career had worked as a construction worker, driving cats and things like that. I knew a lot about the
driving cats.
the other kind of cat.
Okay.
And I thought that there was a romance among those people that I wanted to write, and so I did. And the third novel was the third book was a mystery again. I think.
Yeah, so
yeah.
you returned to the novel, and you've gone back again, and you wrote the Ambrose Bierce series, and then also, of course, you've written many westerns, and you're even in the Cowboy Hall of Fame as a writer of westerns. So you've done this thing very kind of.
The chancellor of this university wrote me. I was a faculty member at UCI, and wrote me and said, congratulated me for being in the Cowboy Hall of Fame, and said, we don't have many professors in that Cowboy Hall of Fame.
I hear that's changed, though.
It may have. I led the way.
So you seem, on the surface then, in a very matter-of-fact way, to have sort of shifted back and forth from among genres and from one genre to another. What are your thoughts or feelings about the question of genre? Do you think that genre fiction, for example, say the detective novel, do you think it gets the credit it deserves, or enough credit, or more credit?
One thing interesting is to go into bookstore and see how many more shelves there are of mystery novels than of novels. I suggest one does that. Wow.
And what
A
does
lot
that-
of people
what do you think
write
that-
mystery
yeah,
novels.
What does that
A lot of people read mystery novels. And I haven't read anybody else's for a long time except yours. But I remember enjoying them thoroughly. When I
So
was,
Ross McDonald, is he?
all those, yeah, people, and with Chandler most of all, of course.
So Raymond Chandler, do you consider him to be, a detective novelist, or do you think of him as being sort of
Well,
just an American?
maybe he may be a detective novelist, but it's a lot more than that. I was a young writer in San Diego State College, and I'd been trying to write stories for Black Mass magazine, which nobody's even heard of anymore. But in that magazine were Chandler and what's
Hammett.
Hammett,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and they.
Michael, we really need to get
Sorry. They seemed to me to be telling some kind of truth that nobody else was telling me at the time. And Chandler was really important to me.
And the Western, did you approach it as a genre?
I had
or
this-
did you find your way to it in a more organic way, or what?
Well, it was a funny way. Well, when I was a boy, my grandmother's house was next to Stuart Lake, the biography of Wyatt Earp. How could a break like that go past you?
Wow.
So I was walking, many years later, walking on the beach in Dunbar, where we were living, trying to think what to write about. And here's this cowboy-looking guy also walking on the beach.
Cowboy looking, in what way was he wearing it?
They have
String tie.
a tiny butt and a pot belly. That's the way cowboys look like. And we got to talking, and I the way you try to make points, I said that I had lived next door, or my grandmother lived next door to Stuart Lake, the biographer of Wyatt Earp, and he said, "That murdering son of a bitch." And this fascinated my attention, so the next day I was off to Tombstone to see what it was. And because I'd been brought up on Wyatt Earp as being the great hero of all Westerns.
Right, of course.
And I did write about a guy like Wyatt Earp. I get his name mixed up with my own guy. My own guy's kind of better than he was.
Were you a big reader of Western?
No.
Not
No, I did. When I got interested, then I started reading the stuff, and there were interesting things to be found. One was that all those pulp magazine Western writers were good writers. They action and the scenery and things were well done, but they were terrible with character.
Right.
They only had 3 or 4 characters to work with. They had the good guy, they had the bad guy, they had the school teacher, or the whore with a heart of gold. You don't have much to work with.
Right, and then the Walter Brennan kind of character.
Something like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, sorry. Just keep passing it back and forth. Okay, so let me move on to my next question. I wanted to ask you about Warlock, the novel that I mentioned before. It's sort of become legendary for having caught the admiration and the attention of Thomas Pynchon and his classmate at Cornell, Richard Farina. I guess I wanted to ask you, first of all, how did you first become aware that there was this, what does he call it, a mini cult around Warlock? And
Nice to have a mini. Huh? I recommend it. And not only that, because Thomas Pynchon then wrote a foreword for a book by his friend.
Right, been down so long.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit up to me. And it mentions my book, and there was a cult following for he mentioned the dialogue, because it doesn't ever hurt your feelings when they talk about your dialogue. And
Have you ever met him, Pynchon?
no, had a little correspondence with him for a while, and then he faded out of mind. But because of that, I think he'd written. I got the Oakley Hall band came into being, and this is another thing I recommend highly: is have a band in your name.
I don't know
If you're going to be a writer.
Do you want to just, maybe people aren't aware of the Oakley Hall band? Can you?
But they do sort of Western rock or something like that, and they're kind of terrific. And they said that they liked something about my books. I suspect that they liked something about Thomas Pynchon, and so they got 2 of my books from him, but I don't know. They're around, and I live now in Nevada City, and some town planners had a big event, Oakley Hall the Man, Oakley Hall the Band. And I was going to read something, and the band was going to play music, and it was a pretty good affair. And I met them all, and they all seemed a lot more intelligent than I thought people who played rock and roll were.
Yeah, I think that's pretty exciting. And it's fun. Every so often I'll catch a reference to the band Oakley Hall, and it always kind of trips me up because
That's the only thing you lack, I think, Michael, so far, the band.
yeah, and it's really eating at me too. I was wondering maybe if you would, I was going to ask you about the movie business and your encounters with it and your work on in the movie business, and then the things that have been done with or to your books. But what I realized was the only thing I really wanted to ask you about was to get you if you would tell a story about James Salter. But maybe you don't want to tell the story about.
No, it's fine.
Oh, okay.
It was The Downhill Racer, which was a movie with Redford made, and James Salter was his guy who wrote screenplays for him. And at that time, screenplays had some kind of literary prominence, and because I sued them, they couldn't use they couldn't put my name on it. They said, because the guy who had bought the book was he was the original. He had some claim on the novel because he had purchased it in the first place, and if they used the novel with my name on it, then they had to pay him off the top. And boy, they don't want to pay anybody off the top. And so I was getting screwed along with him, but he was more majorly getting screwed. And Jim Salter was a good writer on his own behalf. Because I had a lawsuit, he couldn't publish his screenplay as a separate book, which he wanted to do. And so he was going to punch me in the nose when we met, and I heard that. And then my daughter was at Iowa, and she met him when he was teaching in Iowa, and he didn't seem to want to really punch me in the nose. And then we met later on, and it was all right. We shook hands, maybe after a hesitation.
My coda to that is that I met him a few years ago, and I mentioned that you were my teacher, and I had heard there had been some kind of desire expressed to punch you in the nose, and he said no, he was going to punch me in the nose. So, but to me, I've always liked this story just because it evokes that wonderful golden era when writers threatened to punch each other in the nose, which I miss.
I like Richard Ford.
He's done it a few times.
He spat in the. They had a party for me, in some respect, in New York, and he was there, and he spat in the face of one of somebody criticized his book.
Colson Whitehead.
And Colson Whitehead said to him, "I've been spat at by better writers than you." That seemed to be a hell of a good response.
Yeah, that was a little flicker of the old golden era of hostility among writers. Well, I want to give you a chance to do your reading, but I just thought I'd ask one more question, which was we each have 4 children, and I get asked a lot of how do you juggle the demands of having so many children with having your career and your writing, and I don't have a good answer. In fact, my answer's gotten worse and worse over the years, and I can't is now my answer. So what I was going to ask you.
I'll tell you something that will happen to you in your later years, which is that one of your children, a daughter, will be the one who helps you when you're feeble and goes with you to the doctor so you don't forget what the doctor said, and calls up here and says, "My father can't drive at night."
I see.
And things
So
like
that's
that.
a good
Your time
something
will,
to look
your time
forward
will
to.
come.
I can look forward to that. Good. Luckily, I have 2 daughters, so I guess I got.
They'll parcel it out.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was very nice. You bet.
Absolutely. I like it.
I'm going to move you up to that podium.
Microphone. Yeah, I hope. He was asking for whether they're. No, that's working.
It's working
I got
now?
enough light to read.
Ooh. This is this novel is written in the first person. So it's an I narrator, but it's not me. I'd like to get that straight. And my wife wants you especially to know that she never went to Tijuana and had an abortion. Oh boy, I gotta have more light.
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, no.
Is there
You
something-
do. You're right, and that's the fact, which is the problem with, there we go.
Good.
Now, if the mic doesn't hum.
Thank you. The first time I saw Bonnie, the first time I paid attention to her anyway, was December 8th, 1941. We were all in the caf at San Diego State College that Monday morning, listening to the terrible news on the radio. The losses, the deaths, the Day of Infamy, the declaration of war, the Japs. We drank coffee or Cokes and listened to the bad news. No one knew then how much more bad news we were going to have to listen to before a little good news began to filter through. Barbara Bonington, in the college junior I was there, sat at a flat tile-top table with some of my fraternity brothers, including Johnny Pierce, the senior. Barbara Bonington, his sophomore girlfriend, or meat, as the cruder of the brothers would put it, came to the table beside him, bobby socks and saddle shoes, a blue sweater set and pearls around her neck, and his Alpha Beta pin. She had thick blonde hair, blue eyes, and a pretty face with a little pat of baby fat beneath her chin, which vanished when she raised her face to hear the radio on the shelf pouring out its deep-voiced horrors. We hadn't had the time and clues to figure out how we were going to be affected by them yet, although some guys were already blowing off about enlisting and killing Japs. I'd been reading A Farewell to Arms, and I thought about what Hemingway had said about guys dying in the war being like the stockyards in Chicago, except nothing was done with the meat except to bury it, and about bullshit words like in vain. Those poor guys at Pearl Harbor had surely died in vain. Johnny didn't stand up, grinning as he raised a hand, a lazy hand to touch Bonnie's pearl necklace, running the add of pearls through his fingers as he turned the necklace on her pretty neck. It was obvious she didn't like this from the indentations at the corners of her lips, but Johnny kept doing it as she gazed up at the radio. He thought of himself as a big-time coxswain. I considered him an asshole. When I thought about it later, there was something in her stance of the slave girl, come to be fondled by her master. But I liked her posture, straight backed in her sweater, the blunt tips of her breast, lifting the cash bear and the fraternity bin, and the dents at the corner of her lips. Johnny Pierce enlisted in the Air Corps that week and was gone. Well, now, he gets a date with her. Where is this date? They go to the Hotel Del Coronado, which everybody did in San Diego. If you wanted to be big time, you went to the Hotel Del Coronado. And we spent a lot of time there. And Errol Flynn is a character in this novel because you used to see him there all the time. He was a dashing fellow. And you were always a little nervous he was going to take your girlfriend away. He could do it. And so he enters into the book in some way like that. I'm not going to read about him, though. He took her home. You remember in those days there was a terrific problem about whether you kissed your date goodnight or didn't. And if you kissed her goodnight and she didn't think you should have kissed her goodnight, she would be offended. And if you didn't kiss her goodnight, she would be offended also, because you didn't care. So he goes through this troubles, but he doesn't have to do anything about it. Peyton, Bonnie said, didn't go on right away. Then she said, "You have a job south of Broadway, don't you? That funny newspaper down there." "The Brand," I said. I couldn't see her features in the darkness under old Payne's top. "Do you know the people down there?" she asked. "I mean, they're different people down there, aren't they? Closer to things." I couldn't think what she was getting at. "A friend of mine has to have an abortion," she said in a little burst. "I thought you might know someone down there." I managed to say I'd ask around, very easy, although something swelled in my chest to suffocate me because that sure as anything she was talking about her own self and Johnny Pierce. Could you find out about some doctor that does that? It's for a friend of mine, she said. Sure, I said, I'll see what I can find out. Thanks, she said, and opened her car door. She was hastening up the steps to the front door before I could get out to accompany her. I waited until her light came on in her second-story window, and then I started old paint and drove home to my rental room in Normal Heights. In the lighted window of the corner drugstore, as I turned into Meade Street, I could see the newspaper headlines, Rommel escapes desert trap and manpower goal 4 million. Now, I always enjoy the fact that he lives in Normal Heights. He has a professor, he works for a newspaper, a kind of a once-a-week newspaper that's a socialist worker, but everybody calls it a commie sheet. Being a commie or not a commie was very important at that time. And so he gets called the commie a lot because he works for this newspaper. And he gets called it so much that he's kind of gotten stubborn about it. He's going to work there, whatever not. And his professor at the college, he's trying to be a writer. His professor said, anybody with the luck of coming from Normal Heights and working for a commie newspaper doesn't need anything else. Normal Heights. Well, so yes, she is pregnant, and he likes her, and he helps her with her trying to find a doctor who will do an abortion. There were doctors in Tijuana, or I presume there were. I didn't really know. Parked in front of the Clinica Orozco, pretending to read Black Basque, I'd brought along. I didn't have to wait for anything like a half an hour before Bonnie was coming down the steps in her sweater set, skirt, bobby socks, and saddle shoes, with her shining hair caught up in a silver clip. She gave me a flash of a smile as I hustled out of the car and around to where I could take her arm. I thought she might need some support, but she seemed just fine. How was it, I asked, when we were out inside the car? It wasn't so bad. I started old paint and pulled away from the curb. He was a nice man, Bonnie said. He spoke English. She giggled suddenly. I thought of killing myself, she said, like Connie Robinson's sister. Isn't that stupid? Oh, wonderful. Oh, thank you, she whispered. I was trying to get out of Tijuana without getting lost. You're the only one who knows, she said. I said, Johnny, before I could stop myself. He doesn't know. Don't you write him? Oh, no. I didn't understand that. I got past 4 intersections and then turned into the Avenida Revolucion, which is the only way I knew to get to the border. Why wouldn't you write him? I asked. I hate him. What? He said he was going to die, and I had to. But it was just a trick to seduce a stupid fool, and I even knew that it was. The idea that it was all a trick, that she had known it was a trick, carried it along so that I thought the outrage with an ironical twist to it. She had to live with thinking her life was ruined, wondering if she would have to kill herself like Connie Roberts' sister, taking poison on the train coming down from USC. And she got up the nerve to ask her date if he could find an abortionist. There never seemed to you that things get all hooked together once. Sometimes, she said. She was talking brightly and too fast. I didn't even like him, she went on. He scared me. But my mother hated him, and she kept, well, you know. So I wore his pin. I was such a fool. And then when I thought I was pregnant, I couldn't tell her. I couldn't tell anybody. I knew I didn't fool you when I said it was for a friend of mine. It's over now, I said. I slowed into the line of cars waiting to cross the border and stink of exhaust fumes. The customs officer wanted to know where we were born. San Diego, I said. San Diego, Bonnie said, and he waved us on. I drove on the United States. Bonnie locked her hands together in her lap like some kind of gear made of white fingers and bent her head over them so that her hair parted over the back of her neck. I guess I'm not a girl anymore, she said in a shaky voice, but the nape of her neck was a girl's neck. She was crying, and I put my arm around her. So obviously they start going steady right. he goes out, her father's a rather big-time ophthalmologist. You sense the dry voice? Yeah. And they're suspicious of him because they think he's a young communist, because he worked for a commie sheet. So they're going out on their boat, and he's to come along with them. And oh boy, I marked these down so carefully so you wouldn't have to wait while I. Anyway, vote. All right. Well, I think I'll read you about the war then. It's more fun anyway. He gets in the army, of course. That's what we did. Roaring across France in that August heat, 6 of us in the half-track with a machine gun mounted on the cab, M1s, carbines, captured machine pistols, grenades, in the case of Calvados. We couldn't believe our good fortune. We had made no contact with Jerry's, though we had heard gunfire off to the north a couple of times. We just kept going. It was like a rolling vacation. We came into a little burg on a river beyond Orleans, maybe the Yonne, parked on a side street and jumped out under a sky as shiny blue as enamel. Cobbles slanted down to a colorless stretch of river, no one in evidence. We left Tallboy in the half-track, and 5 of us trooped around the corner to a cafe bar with a wooden sign showing a wine bottle and a bunch of purple grapes and a locked door. Pappy Wilson, called Pappy because he was 30, banged on the door and hallooed in French. And a wrinkled old lady with white hair twisted up into a top knot like Jig's Maggie opened up and bowed and muttered what we took to be welcome and stationed herself behind the bar. It was about 3 degrees cooler inside. We knew well enough the word bière, and 4 of us ordered bière and Pappy vin rouge. We sat at a flanked table in an alcove that had a view of the river through a window of small panes. The old lady brought the beers and Pappy's wine, bowing as she set out the glasses. We raised toasts to her, to France, to each other. Of course, we knew it would not go on this easy, but easy it had been so far, wheeling into little burgs like little villes like this one, making sure we kept the retreat line open. Although speed was the order, we were proud of ourselves, as though in this one half-track was winning the war. We never saw any officers communicating by radio, and the orders were to keep going, so we kept going, winning the war by ourselves. Pappy, the first sergeant, and I, a buck sergeant, around the command, second command. Later on, Pappy was killed with the bulge. We all stank of stale sweat and whiskered and dirty and feeling very tough. It was as though the personal stink combined with the pleasant sour stench of the beer and Pappy's wine and the whole wine-encrusted smell of the little bar aroused all the senses. The old woman behind the counter gazed at us anxiously. Tallboy hustled to the door carrying one of the machine pistols. There was a Jerry soldier down there. Standing beside our table, he craned his helmeted head to the window, pointing. We all rose too. There he was, down by the river, just his helmet showing. "Go shoot him," Pappy said to me. "Hold on," I said. "Yeah," Ned said, "if there's one Jerry, there's probably others. You don't want to get anything started." "You better get back to the half-track," Pappy said to Tallboy. "Probably a fucking regiment just over there," Sergeant Orcutt said in South Carolinian. "I don't think there's any fucking sergeant, any fucking regiment over there," Pappy said. I said, "Go shoot him, Pat. That's an order." The thin sun was coming through the high fog, glistening on the cobblestones. Sometimes the helmet moved, sometimes looking to one side, but it never turned back toward us. The German helmet wasn't all that different from the GI, but you immediately knew it. "Better recon first," Rosie said. I just assumed somebody else did the shooting, and Pappy knew that. He was looking pissed off with his eyes jerking around toward the window and back to me. Go shoot him yourself if you want him shot so much, I said. Tallboy had left the machine pistol on the table. Rosie and I had M1s, Paffy a carbine. I drank some beer, but for my dry mouth. Take him prisoner, Ned said. What the fuck are we going to do with a prisoner, Pappy said. Geneva Convention. Fuck the Geneva Convention, Pappy said, leaning over the table, glowering and scratching his whiskered chin with a thumb. Little moral dilemma, Pat? We don't shoot the son of a bitch and he hides out and snipes one of us. Where's your moral dilemma then? Yeah, Rosie said, and you shoot him and there's a fucking regiment just over the hill there and they come out and wipe us all out. Where's your dilemma then? We watched the helmet through the sneaky panes of glass of the alcove window. Sometimes he would turn to look upstream, then downstream, but mostly he just straight ahead. I'll do it, Sheldon Orcutt said. He took off his wireframe glasses out of his breast pocket and fitted them onto his face. I'll do it, I said. I checked the clip on the M1 and went outside. The sun was breaking through the clouds and there was a glare off the damp cobbles. I moved along the side of the building until I had a clear view of the Jerry's helmet and back. I wasn't going to shoot him in the back, and I'd probably only have a second or two before he put up his hands. Achtung, I yelled. The cold metal of the rifle breached against my cheek, and the front sight fixed on him. The helmet turned around, framing a slice of white face. He was a boy in a gray shirt, and with white knees showing between his long stockings and his short pants, wearing a German helmet. He was holding a fishing pole. He dropped it and raised both hands above his helmet. I lowered the rifle and waved a dismissing hand at him. He stared back at me, slowly lowering his hands. I turned to see the faces crowding the window of the little cafe beneath the wooden sign. Off to the west, I could hear the low, approaching roar of the heavy machinery of the 11th Armored. One more war thing, though. Here. Tell me what happened, Sergeant, Major Dickhead said. I stood at attention. He sat at a table with a scarred wooden top in a big room at the Hotel de Ville. His Jeep with its white star was in the room past him, like his horse stalled there. He had a big, pale face, MacArthur comb-over hair on a bald head, and fat hands lying on stacks of paper on the table. There was always the distant racket of firing up to the northeast. I told him what had happened. So you took time out from your mission to arrest this soldier for rape? Yes, sir. Would you say rape was more important than your mission? I didn't answer. He smoothed a hand over his bald head. I'm asking, Sergeant, if you consider the rape more important than the mission to which your unit was assigned. What do you want me to say, sir? He showed me his lower teeth. I want you to tell me, Sergeant, whether you consider the rape more important. Fuck this. Yes, sir, I said. I guess you could say I did. He leaned back in his chair with a sigh, took a pack of old rolls from his breast pocket, tapped it against his finger, withdrew a cigarette, and lit it with a Zippo. He didn't offer me one. Very well, Sergeant. I consider you culpable in this matter. Your mission was your mission. If you say so, sir. Are you being impertinent, Sergeant? I hope not, sir. Rape is an unfortunate concomitant of war, Sergeant. So are many other tragedies. Our mission is to get the war over with. Yes, sir, but it is the kind of thing I have assumed we are fighting against. It is a philosophical sergeant. I don't believe there is room in the TO for a philosophical sergeant soldier. He grinned at me, showing bad teeth, and I had the first sense that I might be losing my stripes. There was a directive, sir, I started. I do not wish to hear of directives, Sergeant. Very good, sir. Major Dickhead blew smoke. Sergeant, I feel I'm encountering a degree of stubbornness. I'm trying to impress you with your error. It was not the time to arrest Corporal Macklin. It might be said that you were responsible for his death. Could you not have arrested, not the arrest have waited until after the mission? Well, sir, all I can say is I didn't think so at the time. Do you think so now? No, sir. When I entered the room, he was raping the woman. I believed I was doing the right thing. And you still do? Well, sir, I considered shooting him. I thought arresting him was the better course. Jesus Christ, Sergeant, that would have been murder. Yes, sir. Many sad tragedies happened in war. At least I had the sense not to say it back to him. It was though I was coming off a drunk, suddenly sober and aware of screwing myself. I said, sir, I came upon him raping her. He'd done the same thing to a young girl at La Haute. I won't mention the directive again, sir, but I disapprove of rape. He stared at me hard-faced. I guess we're in a Mexican standoff, Sergeant, and I have the rank to dissolve it. I want you to admit you made the wrong decision. No, sir. Very well, Sergeant, you give me no option. You were busted back to PFC. Now get out of here. I saluted and left. Outside, I stood taking in deep gulps of cold air. A couple of half-tracks rattled past. At Fort Jackass, we had prepared for a parade for a visiting Major General. All equipment, clothing clean, pressed, spotless, heavy doses of close-order drill, everything perfect. The general, when he came, was in a hurry, so we were ordered to run past him. It was a defining moment for me. I had assumed that, like my father before me, I would somehow be commissioned in the process of the war. After the parade at Fort Jackass, I no longer wished to be an officer because I disliked the whole core of them as carrying on along a principle of bullying and abuse. I hated the process of the more powerful bending the less powerful to their will. It was what I assumed the war to be less against, Hitler being the ultimate example of this power over powerlessness. Allied forces had seized upon the excuse of having to defeat Hitler as their own means to the power of the stronger over the weaker. It was the Allied enlisted man in Europe who was being abused in the process. The generals never went anywhere near the front unless it was to have their photographs made for newspapers, in effect astride their white horses with their sabers pointed at the foe. Major Dickhead kept a careful couple of miles between himself and any action, so he had no idea what the dog-faced boys were doing up on the line. And Captain Shitface was only about a mile better, and was a good part of the time to boot. Lieutenant Smith had been a decent soldier-carrying officer till he cracked up. I was on my way back to report to the captain that I'd been busted when it began to snow. The next day, I didn't think that I had the authority to order 3 repos, not to sneak down to a big farmhouse to do some looting, and a German machine gun ripped them up and ripped up my leg when I tried to drag Ernie Flores out. A Sherman tank came up to blast the farmhouse and the machine gun to gravel. But consequent to my session with the major and my $1 million wound, I missed the first and worst part of the Battle of the Bulge. You stand to hear anything more about the war? He spent some time in Paris where he has a girlfriend. We'll read that. Corinne, he's not AWOL, he's just over leave, but he's thinking about going AWOL. There were in Paris at this time during the war hundreds of thousands of soldiers who were AWOL. A lot of them making money in various good American ways. Corinne sat on the bed reading Le Monde. Fair cropped hair covered her head like pale flames. When they had shaved her head, she had let it grow out this far and then kept it cut short. Sometimes she wore a wig, but more often she faced down what she had to face down. With her sleeping with the Boche cropped head. She hadn't read the Scarlet Letter, and my little French had failed to try to explain it to her. The old royal portable with its French accents I'd bought at the Marché Pousse rested on a little table. Allo, Pat. Allo, Corinne. I went over the window to look over the raked reefs of roofs, the toits de Paris, the toits of Paris. I said I was going to have to go back. Pourquoi? No money. She said she could get money. It was impossible to explain that I was not suited to a life that seemed glamorous in theory, a rebellion against the stupidities of war. In fact, being an AWOL hiding out in a hole in the mansard in Montmartre with a girl who would go out and peddle pussy for money for you, where every time you passed an MP, he would want to check your orders, as with the non-com to the transient messes and transient barracks. It was simply too shitty to do. I picked up the flayed open paperback of Swan's Way and set it aside to seat myself in the rickety chair facing Corinne. She had a pasty, sweet face with startlingly black eyebrows below her cropped head. When she got up to come to me, her breast swung in her blouse. She sat in my lap and traced a finger down my cheek and pressed her lips there with popping little kisses. She'd been in love with a German lieutenant and did not apologize for it. "You'll leave me, Pot," she said. "Just for a while," I said. I thought I could be a writer on the outside looking in spectatorally on the bourgeois bullshit of American life. But I would have to write about the bullshit from inside social reality, condemned to being just what I'd hoped to rebel against. Right from normal heights, Professor Chabon at San Diego State College had advised me. "My sweet boy," Corinne said. She smelled of soap and lavender. She propped my chin up to kiss me on the mouth, her narrow bottom squirming in my lap. She found the furrow of scar in my thigh beneath my pants and traced a finger along it. My wound fascinated her. It was her conviction that most sorrows could be solved in bed, and so we tried that. Shall I go on? Some more? Water. I'm sorry to read so hesitantly. I'm not quite enough light for me. If you can stand it, I can stand it. Oh, come on. God damn it. We knew the war was over. Rumor had it that a white airplane would fly over the lines to notify us of victory in Europe. We were on the Danube then with Russian troops on the other side of the river. Sometimes Russians came over by boat, unkempt, enthusiastic guys with partial uniforms and their munchkin-looking caps. They kissed any American they could catch and stole the company radio. When Captain Shitface complained to a Russian colonel, the colonel assured him that the culprits would be found out and shot. After that, there was not much commerce between the Russians on the east bank and us on the west. We moved on up the river in our half-tracks, watching for the white airplane. Beautiful, cool, and warm days with the fruit trees in flower and puffs of cloud, as though this was a part of the world where nothing bad could ever happen. Advanced elements ran into a firefight, and we moved with glacial reluctance up into position. No one wanted to get killed in the last days of the war. Tanks came up and fired some rounds, and we shut down for 2 days with a convoy of supply trucks coming up with food for the prisoners who would be liberated before we started on. We could smell the camp before we reached it. At first, no one identified the smell, like some kind of garbage dump. Then we came over a low ridge, and there was the barbed wire, an impressive-looking structure that must be a cell block and ranks of low wooden buildings. Inside a gate, there were about 1 million people in black and white striped pajamas, waving their arms, and over the gate was a banner with the message, "Welcome, American." Bungie, the driver, apparently didn't want to go down there either because he slowed going down the hill, and a couple of other half-tracks hustled on ahead of us to liberate the Frigga work camp. Inside the gate, we were surrounded by the prisoners in their chain gang outfits, clogs on their filthy feet. They all looked like clothes on hangers. They were so skinny, with faces carved out of hard, grainy wood. They were happy enough to see us, cheering and waving with big rotten teeth smiles, and the terrible stink. One of them climbed onto my half-track and motioned to us to keep going, pushing on through the crowd of prisoners. "Come, Americana, see," something like that. So I got the gist of it and told Bungie to keep going. One of the other half-tracks fell in behind us, as though they had a guide also. We ran out of the crowd along the wire on muddy ground. Ahead there were 2 of the gray Kraut bulldozers, not moving. So we came to the pit where they tried to bury the corpses. The firefight must have been to hold us up until a bulldozer had covered over the bodies. They hadn't got it done. More than 1,800 bodies were counted in that pit. They were stacked neatly in the Kraut way, naked men and a few women. I looked from face to face in the half-track and knew that no one else like I myself could think what expression to wear on his face. Our guide was grinning, pointing. Later, Colonel Grady assembled the men and women from the village who, of course, maintained they'd had no idea that such things were going on. They just thought there was a camp where prisoners of war were making some airplane parts for the Wehrmacht. and there was a rock quarry. We herded the villagers down to the camp to dig up the corpses and cover it over the bulldozers, taking some pleasure in their weeping and puking and whining. Our own bulldozers dug new pits, and the villagers carried the bodies to them and laid them out. I guess it made us feel better. There was an awful kind of helplessness. Some of the prisoners died from our feeding them. They had to be weaned back onto food, thin gruel to start with. Luckily, Colonel Grady knew enough to lay that out early on. There were some Pole prisoners who were as excited about kissing American soldiers as the Russians had been. But by now, we knew enough to keep a hand on our wallets and an eye on the radio. The Poles were in the best shape of any of the prisoners, as the detachment of them had come in only 2 weeks ago. Tallboy and Joe Pugh and I and some others talked with a Brit prisoner of war who was not in bad shape, but he'd bailed out of a fighter in March. I asked him what had happened to the guards. Most of them they drowned in the river yesterday, he said. They had a kind of bucket brigade, and they'd pass the buggers along down the river. The Poles held them under till and then let them float on down. The commandant was a Colonel Boltman, who escaped over the river. The real sadist was Colonel Haupt, who'd also escaped. Too bad about that. There was a major they tore apart, guards and capos, they killed them. The limey lieutenant discussed it calmly. The camp was a work camp, slave labor. All nationalities were mostly Russian, French, Hungarian, and Polish, plus some Italian politicals and some gypsies. The cell block was for important political prisoners. There had been a Rothschild there and a member of the Polish nobility, but they were gone, flown out in junkers last month. Outside the gate, the building a little way up the ridge was the officers' barracks. The officers had girl prisoners for sex. The attractive girls among the prisoners were assigned to the officers, and some of the officers kept their mistresses in rooms in the village away from the stink of the camp. The prisoners who had mechanical abilities were assigned to the aircraft factory near the village, marched there at 5 o'clock in the morning and back at 5 o'clock at night. Less fortunate prisoners, especially the Russians, worked in the quarry breaking rock. There were 186 down into the quarry, 186 back up. Prisoners did not make their 20 or 30 trips a day for many days. Colonel Haupt liked to hang out on the rim of this quarry with his Luger and shoot anybody who halted to rest and to climb out. Others would be nailed to carry the bodies out, and they had better not pause to rest either. Hoff had a number of nifty tricks for Luger practice as well. He was the worst of the krauts, the limey said. We took on what seemed our priority, which was feeding those poor people in their stripes and clogs, keeping order mostly. You had to hold them back from gorging on the bread and meat and carrot and turnip stew the cooks were able to jack up in quantity so they wouldn't die in convulsions, as we saw more and more than one of them do, feeding them in that terrible stink that only diminished when the bodies had been reburied in trenches. But many among them were too far gone, dying, and they had to be taken care of too. It was both the worst time of the war, there at the very end of it, and the best, because the police platoon, company, battalion were not just killing crowds, but trying to save lives. And we did try, and we did save lives, and we were better for it. There was still that awful, deep-running current of outrage for the deadly cocksuckers who do such a thing like this ran through and underneath everything. For some reason, the prisoners weren't crazy to break out and start walking home, wherever home was, as they had to savor their liberty on the site and the food furnished to them by us and later by the Swedish Red Cross. The limey took us through the cell block, which was empty now. The accommodations were not bad for a prison camp. The cells had writing tables. Some of them had easy chairs, cots with white coverlets, a crucifix on the wall. The emptiness of the place echoing in our boots was spooky. Later, I went to look at the officers' quarters with Talboy and Lieutenant Matt Smithers. There was a big downstairs common room with easy chairs and sofas and lamps, and an office in the window looking out on the barbed wire and the hovels of the prisoners behind the wire. There were women there, but not bad looking either. Talboy took upstairs a pretty gypsy woman who was willing enough and came down with a case of crabs that hung on for a month. Lieutenant Smithers, who prowled through the office, called me over. He had held a parchment shade out at a slant from the lamp, and he pointed it with his other hand. I approached with that end of the war a lot reluctant, hoping there's not going to be just one more thing I didn't want to have to know about. And it was that all right. It was a tattoo on the lampshade, a heart with a double eagle head looking over the top, and in the heart some Cyrillic words, a tattoo that belonged on somebody's body once. After 10 days, about 10 days after we liberated the camp, Lieutenant Smithers came off the phone with a finger pointed at me. We were in the commons of the officers' barracks. Daltrey, there's another report that bird Hop's been seen in the village, visiting some snatch there. Take a couple of guys and go take a look. Sometimes it'll maybe not be a false alarm. Robbie and Bunker and I took off in the company jeep. Robbie driving, Bunker in the back. I sat with a boot braced on the dash and a .45 holstered on my belt. There had been 3 reports of Colonel Hoff seen in town from suck-up villagers. Robbie drove up the dirt road to the village past a dump of rusting Kraut earth-moving equipment. Down in the next valley were the big hangar buildings of the closed-up aircraft factory. Black humped roofs gleamed in the sun. From the ridge, we could look back on the camp to in its wire-enclosed spread, backed up by the glistening ochre and shattered rock face of the quarry, and its top fringe of grasses and black woods. A Red Cross flag stirred in a little wind. The Swedish Red Cross had come in and to take charge of the poor bastard inmates. They knew from other liberated camps how to bring the skeletons back from starvation. The war was definitely over, and rumors kept coming that we'd be moving on north along the river. Robbie roared on into the town with its 2-story tile-roofed houses like a toy village where the good Austrians claimed they hadn't known of the camp 5 miles away that you could smell if the wind was right and also when it wasn't, and see the prisoners going in files to and from the aircraft parts factory. We knew the place where Huft had been seen, and Robbie slammed the jeep to a halt before the building with a closed-up pharmacy on the ground floor. The door to the apartment upstairs was bolted, but Bunker shouldered it open, and I sprinted up the stairs with the other 2 behind me. Ahead, I heard a woman screech. A woman screeched warning. I shoved and opened another door and followed the .45 in. A fat, blonde young woman in a petticoat stood barefoot by the window as though thinking of jumping out. A man in a civilian jacket, corduroy pants, a blue shirt, and a striped tie faced me smiling. "Colonel Hoft," I said, as the others came in behind me. He made a shrugging motion of his upper body, still smiling. "Hi, fellows," he said. "Any of you from New Jersey?" he asked. I felt silly holding the .45, so I holstered it. Robbie and Bunker carried M1s. "I spent over 7 years in Lakewood," Huff said, with no trace of a crowd accent. "7 good years," he said, smiling, nodding. The woman sat down in the window seat, hands on her lap. She had a creamy pink and pale fat girl complexion, and she stared anxiously at me. Huff had a dark, lined face with neatly brushed hair growing low on his forehead. "There was a little bar there where you could get a good lager," he said, "or a bottle of Gerolsteiner if you were so inclined." "Pat," Bunker said, and I put my hand on the butt of the .45 and the crowded button in his jacket. He took the jacket off and laid it on the bed. He made a gesture asking permission and stepped to the big armoire against the wall. I drew the .45 again as he opened the drawer of the armoire. He took from a hanger a Kraut uniform blouse and armed into it. It had a colonel's insignia on the collar and the black lapels of the SS. The girl murmured in German. "My uncle is American," the colonel went on. He has a butcher there, a very fine modern shop, very nice, all modern things. I worked for him. "I understood you were a butcher here," I said. His smile did not falter. "I kept company with a very nice girl there," he went on. "Her father was an automobile dealer. She was very nice. Sometimes we would go on picnics." He made the permission gesture again and took a uniform cap from the shelf of the armor and donned it. Now he wore a colonel's cap and a blouse and the brown corduroy trousers and striped tie. He had straightened so he was standing at attention. His shiny shoes set at right angles to each other. I told him he was under arrest. He shook his head. I could see the gold-filled tooth at the corner of his lip. "Ah, no," he said. His voice had become deeper, that harsh Germanic bark I will only surrender to a person of proper rank, he said. I will not surrender to a sergeant. Yes, you will, I said. He shook his head again. He made a military right face and started toward the door beyond the bed. Halt, I said, cocking the .45. He marched toward the door. I skipped after him and swatted him hard in the back of the head with the barrel of the .45. The woman screamed as Huff went down on his face, the calf rolling free. I went over him as he laboriously turned on his back. He glared up at me, his mouth working. He spat in my face. I jerked upright, swiping at my cheek. Then I jammed the muzzle of the .45 into his mouth. My finger contracted on the trigger, but just then Bunker swung his combat boot and kicked the colonel in the head, putting out the lights. There was no point in killing him if he didn't know I was killing him. Get him out of here, I said. Now I want to, this part reminds me of an act of great cleverness that I performed, which is from a play by Bertolt Brecht called Galileo. Anybody remember the play Galileo? You remember a scene in Galileo, like, a little bit like this scene, where the Pope puts on his papal clothes. With each one, he becomes more and more the Pope. And when he's been kind of a good pal to Galileo, he just turns into the Pope as he puts clothes on him. I stole it from him. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks. Any questions? Thank you, Bob. Have we?
Will you continue the Bierce series, or have a finale to it when maybe the associate goes searching?
Well, I wanted to know, but Viking didn't want any more of them. They hadn't done very well. I was going to do one more and kill the son of a. I was going to do one more and kill the son of a bitch, but I kind of knew how he died, and I was trying not to do that. No, I'm not going to do it anymore. No, they didn't do very well for Viking. Why would that be when they're so good? Incisive questions, please. Thank you again.
Thank you.